that have been filtering in. This will be a very serious and open discussion about this topic. If at any point you do feel unsafe, if this has brought up any memories, if this has triggered you in any way, feel free to leave. We are recording this for future use. It is being recorded right now, so you will be able to revisit the content in the future. And if you do need help, please contact Hartley House. Their 24-hour hotline is 301-662-8800. Alrighty, so let's just go over one more time about the particulars of how we will enact with tonight. We have disabled the chat feature, so we will not be using the chat feature to reach out with the audience tonight. Primarily, you'll be using the Q&A. If you have a question for any of our panelists, any of our participants, please use the Q&A feature. We have some moderators that will be paying attention to general Hartley House questions or services, but please do not consider this in any way a therapy session, or just because of your attendance, that does not guarantee you access to the services of Hartley House. We are looking for questions for our panelists. We will be having an open discussion after our keynote speaker. You can also expect polls at one point. We'll be having a couple of polls. The reason we're doing that is to find out a little bit more about our audience. We have over 90 people here. We want to get an idea, a feel of who is here and what your background is on the topic before we move into our keynote speaker. So we're looking very forward to talking with everyone tonight. Keep in mind, you can see our 24-hour hotline there, 301-662-8800. The Hartley House website is always available. Their social medias are also great outlets. Looks like we can begin. So let me give one final overview of a couple of our particulars, and we'll start the event. It's important to know that everyone is muted, that we will be using the Q&A, and you should set this to speaker view if you really want to enjoy tonight's event. Speaker view is the best way to watch this, considering we'll be using a panel display and we'll have multiple speakers. And because this is the event of this nature, we do reserve the right to remove any attendees that are making it unsafe for audience members, panelists, or presenters. This is a live virtual event. This is all happening live. This is not pre-recorded, but we are recording it right now. So please keep that in mind as you interact with our panelists, the polls, the Q&A feature, and any of that ways. This is not a therapy session or professional counseling. The point of this event is to create a conversation. We have an amazing panel that will show you this topic from very different walks of life. And it's a very exciting thing, but this does not count as a therapy session. Please do not consider this professional counseling. And attending this event is voluntary and in no way implies or guarantees you access to the services of Hartley. And just one final time to be clear, we intend this event to be for 18 and up. We will be diving very frankly into everything that we're going to be discussing here. So some of it could be troubling. Some of it could bring up feelings and emotions. If you were triggered, feel free to leave. And you can reach out to the Hartley House 24-hour hotline at 301-662-8800. And with that, I'd like to welcome everyone here to this amazing event. My name is Pat Mendonca. I am also known as Patrick Haynes on 99.9 WFRE. I'll say my backstory. I bumbled into helping Hartley House. I met them at an event, didn't know what the name meant, and among talking with and getting to know the people of Hartley House, it's been impossible not to try and find any and all ways that I can help them. And I'm honored to be a part of the event. I've walked and walk a mile, and now it's rock a mile. There's so many amazing parts of Hartley House. And I've been the MC for the Affairs of the Heart. This is an amazing organization. If you're not familiar with them or CAPES, please take this all in tonight. Share this out. They're doing so much good, and it is an organization well worth supporting, especially with everything and the challenges that are going on right now. It is my pleasure at this moment to introduce the President and Executive Director of Hartley House, Dr. Inga James. Inga, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Pat. It's great to see all you, or know that you're all out there. I'm really glad that you could join us tonight. This is an experiment for us. You're kind of like our guinea pigs, because we usually do face-to-face outreach and community education, and obviously we can't do that right now. So we're looking at technology, and it's compelling us and propelling us into the future. And I, for myself, I'm very excited about that. Like Pat said, I am the president and executive director of Hartley House, which is the only organization in Frederick County, Maryland, that provides comprehensive services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and child abuse. We have a long history. People started looking at domestic violence and sexual assault in our county in 1977. And a few women got together and noticed there weren't any services, just like a lot of places in the 1970s. There weren't services for victims of sexual assault or domestic violence. So they took it upon themselves to collect data from the Department of Social Services, from law enforcement, put together some compelling data that they then presented to county council and other community leaders. And the county council created the, I think it was called the Task Force for Battered Women or Battered Spouses. And that's when they then became incorporated in '79. And we set 7 goals for ourselves, including having a hotline, a shelter, counseling services, legal services, medical accompaniment, abuse services, and a hotline. And we're still following that model today. So we were able to fill all their goals, to meet all their goals, and to move forward. And so it's very exciting. Hartley House has a holistic approach to serving victims of violence, because we believe that it's important to serve the whole person in overcoming such a traumatic event as sexual or physical abuse. And so we provide wraparound services, including legal representation, counseling services with both group and individual therapy for both adults and children. We have a 29-bed emergency shelter, and we're still, even through the crisis, accepting residents. And actually, just in the last 2 days, we accepted 2 more families into our shelter. We have our 24-hour hotline, which is also operating. We have our abuse intervention program. And we have our outreach and prevention services, which is what this event is all about, providing information to the community to help victims provide better services for victims. The only service we're not providing right now is our medical accompaniment services. We just don't feel it's safe to send our advocates into the hospital at this time. We work on the empowerment model, which means we understand that when a person is the victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, a certain amount of power is taken from that victim in order to overcome that victim. So a lot of the power has been stripped from the victims that we see and the survivors that we see, and building up their internal power as well as their external power, their credit, their financial resources, their social support systems, those kinds of power as well. But we're interested in building up their internal power so that they can go out and feel that they can be self-sufficient. So our rule is that we don't provide any services to anybody who doesn't want the services unless they're an abuser. And our empowerment model helps us to remember that we're not the ones making decisions for victims. We also use a trauma-informed model, which is the foundation is that we know that most of us have been through trauma at some point in our lives, and that most of the people around us have been through trauma, much of it in their childhood. And that we have all built up coping mechanisms in response to that trauma that helped us at one point in time, but may not be helping us now. And that behaviors are a result of these coping mechanisms in order to overcome the trauma. and these behaviors may be maladaptive or dysfunctional or self-injuring at this point. So we make the assumption that everybody's suffered trauma and their behavior is an output of that trauma, and we need to help them create adaptive behaviors as opposed to maladaptive. About 3 years ago, our keynote speaker came to us and said that he was looking for a survivor group. We did not at that time have a survivor group for male survivors of child sexual abuse. So we started working on finding some funding, and we were able to find some short-term funding, which turned into some longer-term funding. And we've been able to renew that funding every year to provide a therapeutic group for male survivors of child sexual abuse. This group meets twice a month and is led by the therapist that will speak on the panel in a few minutes, and is doing very, very well. Unfortunately, the last last group that Doug, our keynote, was going to was more than 2 hours away, and he was doing that twice a month in order to be able to take part in those services. But we've been able to, in Frederick County here, provide one of our own. So if there are any survivors who are interested in serving with or participating in a group, please call our hotline at 301-662-8800 and let them know you're interested, and they'll tell you what to do and they'll walk you through it. We know, or we say we know, that 1 out of 6 men or boys are sexually assaulted before the age of 18, 1 out of 6. If you talk to experts and advocates and survivors, they're going to tell you it's a lot more than that. If they're going to tell you it's more like 1 out of 5 or maybe even 1 out of 4. And on the one hand, those statistics frighten me, because that means there are a lot more people that are walking around that are not getting services, because we certainly see far fewer than even 1 out of 6. The other thing is that we're not able to capture the numbers adequately or accurately if that's the case. If it's really 1 out of 4 and we're only seeing 1 out of 6, there's a lot of things going on that we don't know about, and that's frightening to me too. And that's why we're opening up this discussion tonight. It's time to start talking about it. It's time to bring to our communities the services that male survivors and male victims need. Boys and teens and men all need the same services that we've been giving to girls, adolescent girls, and women. So we're hoping to start the trend in the area tonight. I want to repeat what Patrick said, which is that if you feel triggered, if it starts to feel uncomfortable, if you feel your heart speeding up or maybe getting sweaty, anything that tells you you're not in the right place at the right time, please turn off. And if you feel like you can, give us a call again at 301-662-8800. We're not going to make any therapeutic recommendations tonight, certainly no diagnoses. This is for information and education only. And the last recommendation, or the last statement I wanted to make about this, is that it's our intention to help survivors that are out there get the help they need, whether it's us or somebody else. And so Hartley House will do whatever it can to lead the services to the survivors, because I think it's important to get to survivors where they are. One last thing I want to say about the impact of COVID right now. First of all, I'm seeing it as having a silver lining, because we're getting to try all this really new, interesting technological models that we've never done before, and that hopefully can get the word out much farther than we've ever done before. But the other thing is that we know that Both domestic violence and sexual assault are going to increase during this crisis. As long as people are living in these kinds of conditions together, the result is going to be escalated stress, increased feeling an increased feeling of loss of control. And when that happens, we know that violence happens. And so we are sitting kind of on the edge of our seats waiting for that to happen. But we know it's going to be a huge burden on us, on the community, and on anybody else that's working with victims right now. So I just would alert you to the fact that domestic violence and sexual assault services all over the country, no matter where you are going to be very overwhelmed when people start hitting the streets again and start being able to call for help, because right now they're not really able to. Thank you for listening to me. I am really excited you're here. I can't wait to hear your questions, and I hope you enjoy our panel. I'm going to turn it back over to Patrick right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inga. And now, before we move on, everyone, we have a couple of polls. You can answer these anonymously. The point of these polls is to make sure that we have a little bit of an idea of what our audience is like tonight. So everyone should see our first poll right now. And right now, we're just trying to get an idea of who is attending this talk tonight. There we go. I'm starting to get some responses. Whoop, they're flooding in. Oh my goodness. So feel free, this is completely anonymous. We just want to use this to have an idea of the people that are here in attendance tonight. We'll be wrapping up this first poll in about 10 seconds or so. But we've seen an amazing amount of responses. All right, I'm going to wrap it up in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And here are our results, everyone. So you can see we have a lot of social workers with us tonight. We know we have people that have known survivors. We have female survivors. We have people who are new to this. And I think this is just similar to our panel. We got people from all different walks. We have our second question is, oops, hold on there. There we go. Now, Inga kind of touched on this, so this is becoming a little bit of a, do you know, or what do you feel about this? There we go. And this is something to keep in mind. Yet again, this is something that we'll be touching on during the panel discussion. I know that Doug, our keynote speaker, will be touching on this as well. And I'm going to wrap this one up in just a moment. Now that we have, there we go, over 80% in. You can see this, most people see 1 and 6. You're going to hear the number 1 and 6 a lot tonight. 1 and 4, most likely the reality. It is an issue that everyone has seen. Let me bring up our final poll question. Remember, these are just so we can get an idea of who is in our audience. And this is a very interesting one. How many years after sexual abuse will a male survivor disclosed it happened? And this is something I want everyone to kind of keep this one in mind, in particular as we reach our panel discussion, as you hear our keynote speaker. Question is, how many years after a sexual abuse will a male survivor disclose that it happened? We'll close the poll once we get to a little over 80%. Oh, we're already there. All right, and let's see our answers. And yeah, after 20 years is the correct answer on that one. That's something that I think we can all talk about tonight. This is a problem that echoes throughout an entire person's life after 20 years. So now we have an idea of who's with us tonight and a couple of facts before we reach into us. And I think it's important to remind here again, these are the topics we will be discussing. If at any point you feel triggered, feel free to leave and feel free to reach out to the Hartley House hotline 301-662-8800. All right, and those are our three polls. We have a basic idea of who we have in our audience, and now I'd like to discuss just a little brief preview of who our panelists are. We have a survivor, David A. Washington. He'll be joining us in a little bit. You can see, and these are some of the faces you're already seeing in the upper part of your screen. We have Paul Hatfield. He is our therapist tonight. We have Monica. Amazing presenter. How to survive. You'll be able to catch up with them after our keynote speaker. Remember, David, Paul, Monica. We have a survivor, a therapist, and a parent. If you have already kind of questions for them, please add those to the Q&A, and I'll make sure that they get to them when we reach our panel discussion. And now we also have one final panelist and our keynote speaker. Annette Tender is also part of our panel discussion, but she is also one of the founders of CAPES. If you want to know, if you have questions for the spouse perspective or for someone who founded, please keep her in mind, add that to the Q&A. And right now it is my pleasure to hand it over to Doug and Annette. That is our keynote speaker and founders and survivors for tonight. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Again, pleasure to be here tonight. And we just wanted to spend 1 minute here of the generation of CAPES and its birth and its origins. And very thankful for Hartley House to allow us to bring this out and into the public as part of our mission. But I wanted to have Annette she was the initial inspiration of where this started, or the thought process. That this has actually been about 1.5 years in the making of trying to pull something together, and we kind of had it all together to be in person, and life changed on us quickly, and we were all able to pivot quickly to come around to online, which actually in some regards I think turned out to be a blessing, as our audience now has increased. So the program's a little bit different, but I think it's still going to hit the mark on what we need to do. So
yeah, so how the CAPES concept itself came to me. Doug and I were at a Elton John concert. We're watching the backdrop of the AIDS quilt, and Elton was talking about all his work with that. And I thought that male survivors of childhood sexual abuse needed a symbol for people to rally around, and because they needed to bring this issue to our public attention and normalize the conversation to help these men heal. So Doug and I, we chatted about it a bit more, and we both agreed that many boys want to be superheroes, wearing their superhero capes. And many of those superheroes have sidekicks. They're supporting and lifting up their superheroes. So that's how we came up with the concept of capes. Because you have your person who is the survivor, and then also their support network. So then with the help from Doug and the wonderful people at Hartley House, this whole CAPE concept was launched, and we are here today now. And so I thank everybody for being here with us, and I'm gonna join you later as a panelist, and I'll let Doug begin his keynote.
And she's going back up to her other Hollywood Squares spot on the on the grid. So again, just real quick, community awareness, promoting empowerment for male survivors. Again, pulling on a little superhero theme, and this will hopefully resonate through most of the audience today. Community, I don't want it to be. It's not so broad. Community can be your partner, it can be your friend, it can be your parent. That is the definition of community here. But it is also our greater community that has to also contribute to this and where we need to go. So hopefully this evening, I hope to just scratch the surface a little bit and give you guys a little insight of the path of a survivor and how that healing begins, and a little bit of what life is, was, and can be like from a survivor's point of view. So just real quick, I think we've all seen the news. Some of these are actually getting a little bit dated, which is kind of good. All these changes in social awareness. When I first attempted a healing journey 25 years ago, none of this was talked about. And we have a much different social awareness now, and the dialogue is starting. And I think we're now finally starting to see the dialogue begin around male survivors. I think often we're the underserved and the forgotten, not by choice, but it's, as you saw, it takes so long for men to disclose their abuse or the trauma that occurred, in of itself makes it difficult to find and develop those services. So we're seeing a big trend in the social awareness of what's going on, and all those things were largely, sensationalized and so forth, and that's a good thing. What we're trying to direct a conversation to tonight, and I think it's very important, is after the headline. What about the folks that were traumatized by these events or these individuals or these components, and what that is like? Because once it's off the news, it's still not over for those that were inflicted. So I wanted to go into a little bit of an evolution of change. And again, this is from my perspective. The quote you see at the bottom of your screen, I actually stole from another survivor I found on the web. And, there gets to be a debate of whether or not you're, a victim or a survivor. And I've actually added hero and advocate to this slide for discussion. If you asked me, 5-10 years ago, I would have told you I was a survivor. And as I got into my healing journey into therapy and my recovery, it quickly became evident to me that I was really still a victim, and a lot of parts of myself were still a victim to the original abuser. Although I was functioning, I was still being held captive to that component. And I add the hero here because I think as we go through the healing process, there are heroes within us and each part of us. And there's a lot of hero survivors out there that I think we need to acknowledge as we move forward. And, in some cases, we've got to be our own greatest advocate. So, it's okay. You may have different components of you that are in different spectrums of this. But I think it's important to draw a distinction of where you may be or where you could be going. So just a little thought, and again, this is kind of the path I took, and I don't think it's that uncommon for survivors. We've learned to keep secrets for decades. It's what we do, and add the social norms of masculinity that we have to man up. This doesn't happen to boys, and everything that we need to do becomes very secretive and problematic if we do choose to change. And, back again, I'm going back 20 years when I first made an attempt to try to address this. The web really didn't exist. Those tool sets weren't available. But in today's world, I think one of the first steps a lot of male survivors will do is they'll take to the digital arena or the books, those things that they can do somewhat in secrecy and somewhat in privacy to begin to try to understand their past, what happened to them, what's going on in their lives, how do I fix this, how do I change this, how do I behave differently. And then I think from that, becomes the next evolution is, individual contact, whether or not that be individual therapy, working with a partner or whatever have you to help guide you through that path. And then ultimately, I think we get to a point on that journey that community begins to play a significant role. For me, that's true. Whether or not that be beginning to disclose to individuals around me, the greater community, the group of other survivors that I've met, the individuals in this audience today coming out, because the more that I tell and the more that I talk about it, the greater connection I have and the better off I'm doing in coming forward and in my growth pattern. So knowing that was somewhat the path, and I don't want to get into all the ugliness of my abuse and what happened, because that isn't necessarily the purpose of tonight's discussion. I think a lot of survivors, we have a story. But I do want to share a little bit. The quote you see on your screen right now is, "He made his family the center of his world, no armchair Christian. He lived his faith. He took Jesus' teaching that whatever you did for the least of my brothers, you also did for me as a marching order. I share that because that is part of my abuser's obituary. He was one of my best friend's fathers, and as part of that was very close to me. And as you can see, up until his death, the world really didn't know who he was. I knew him as somebody else. And, you know, probably up until a while ago, I probably still would have denied that he did anything just because of the power that he had over me. And I share that because as you think about a child going through this, one of the things that's probably the most difficult things to do is we don't have the vocabulary to articulate what has happened, what is going on, how to communicate everything that's going on inside us and trying to deal with that. And I think that's a significant challenge as we go through this. And even as an adult going through this, it is an extremely difficult thing to now voice and come up with the words to help other folks understand the trauma and what we're individually going through. So just a real quick recap of the past couple of decades as I go through this. So, you know, my abuse occurred during my adolescence, and I was groomed and I was seduced and coerced into the abuse that happened to me. And, you know, in my teens, I was surviving. I was getting by, not really understanding what was happening, what was going on. You know, at that age, you're more worried about whether or not you've got orange shoelaces or green shoelaces when you go into the school for the day. So it was really about surviving and basically just getting through life the best I could. Then the 20s came and, you know, tried to start to figure it out. Some of the trauma was bubbling up. Behavior wasn't always the best. Indulged in the drink probably a little bit too often. And when I did do it too often, it was often too much. And I think that's a common pattern that comes with it, but not actually understanding why, but it just felt like that was what was supposed to be done. And then surprisingly, you know, tried therapy back then, and quite frankly, it just didn't stick, didn't work. And the tools weren't back there in the 90s. I think the only book that I was aware of that was out was a book by Mike Liu called Victims No Longer. And, you know, it was really difficult to begin that journey, much different than today. You can find a little bit of support on the internet between malesurvivor.org and 1 in 6 and a few other national sites that can help you out to get you started. But all in all, there's still very limited information out there. And then surprisingly, the 30s came. My son was born, and you know, it all became about my family and our household, and all of it was gone. Surprisingly, it very rarely entered into my mind. Occasional relapse here and there, and, you know, to be honest, kind of thought, oh, I have this licked. But, you know, it's a parasite that's implanted in you when it occurs, and it'll eventually seep out slowly but surely. And then the 40s came. In my late 40s, life was changing. You know, we get to a little bit later in life, and slowly all the emotions and all the components began to resurface, and I had to deal with them. And now in my 50s, focusing on the advocacy, because, you know, one of the things that happened is part of my healing was, again, to reach out to community. And I had a list of several individuals that I needed to tell in person what was going on. And for those that may not know a survivor, or if a survivor tells you that they have been abused, and if that is the only thing that they can utter, that is an amazing gift that they are giving you, and an amazing amount of trust. I can tell you the first time I told somebody outside of my spouse, I was trembling and shaking, and it wasn't necessarily just to give the details, but it was simply to utter the word that I was abused and something happened. it just demonstrates the amount of power that it has over you, and it is ingrained into every fiber of your being. And it is an enormous amount of effort, energy, and inertia to get through that. So I just share that with you because I think it's very important that as more and more survivors, and especially male survivors as they come forward, it's a very difficult task to do. It does get a little bit easier, at least for me, as time goes on, but it's still very difficult. Next one. So one thing I did want to reference here is, and many of the survivors come from very different past experiences. And, as you saw, many of us don't disclose. It takes us 20, 30, 40 years to get to that point. And we become masters at protecting the part of us that got hurt. And, I stole this image from the internet because I think it just says a lot of what's going on. And, through my journey, I've shared some very specific components of my story with other survivors. And one of the big things that resonated with me after I shared some very specific details about a specific event is a fellow survivor had said something to me that says, I may not relate to the exact event story that I had just told, but I know how you felt the moment after. And that is probably one of the most empowerment words I think a survivor can hear. It is the acknowledgement that they are not alone. There is validation of those emotions that they're feeling, and all that goes with it. And I think it's probably one of the biggest points that when an individual and a survivor can get to the point of that community, it is one of the huge stepping stones that propels us forward on our journey. And the other component here that I've learned as I've gone through this journey is, we learn a lot as children. And, a lot of the stuff that we learned as children were absolute, both the good and the bad. So those trauma events, those abusive events, we perceived as absolutes, and those were to us the normal. Those were the expected. We knew no different. And the big challenge in healing is to understand and turn those around, that they are not absolute, and that is not the way that things need to be, which is also not a very easy task, because again, lessons learned that have been there for a long time and have spent 30, 40 years rattling around only your head that you've talked to, is a difficult habit to break. Before I close, I wanted to share one poem I wrote during part of the journey I was on. And again, this is part of, I take to writing quite a bit, almost every day, to the extent that I can. And it goes back to gaining the vocabulary and understanding and converting what those feelings were as a child and understanding them to some degree as an adult, and to begin to listen to the past as opposed to just observing the past. So this was a poem I wrote a while back. I was pretty deep in therapy, and it kind of articulated the moment of the time during the abuse, during that period. He was there, no one was there. He was there, no one was there, I was confused. He was there, no one was there, I was alone. He was there, no one was there, I was ashamed. He was there, no one was there, I was guilty. He was there, no one was there, I was afraid. He was there, no one was there, I was powerless. He was there, no one was there, I was silent. So I want to thank you all for giving me a few moments of your time this evening. I know we just scratched the surface, a little bit of my story, but just to give you some thoughts as we go into the panelist discussion tonight. I strongly encourage you to ask questions of all the panelists or myself. And again, we've got some very unique backgrounds, and you know, a survivor's journey is not just his journey or her journey. It is a community's journey, because the tentacles of that abuse transcend just the individual. However, one of the things that I think is very important, and that is part of the reason I do this, and I try to talk to and communicate with as many survivors as possible, is, you know, the childhood trauma occurred at the most intimate, most personal and individual level possible, and healing must also occur at that individual connected level. I think there's a lot of resources out there that help, but it is community that I think, you know, actually helps lift up a survivor and help with the healing component. So I thank you again. I thank Hartley House for being such a generous sponsor to this event, and to all the male survivors, especially in the Frederick area, as we continue on the informative and healing missions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for spearheading this event. We're about to open our panel discussion. I just want to remind everybody, maybe some people joined late, we are not using the chat function. Audience members cannot chat. It's so we can keep better track of it. The Q&A feature allows us to close questions as they're answered. It allows us to organize it a little bit more. So we are not using the chat feature tonight. I saw a Q&A about that. So just to let people know. So now moving forward, we have an amazing group of panelists. I want to give each of them an opportunity to let you know who they are, why they're a part of this, and their story. And I'd like to start with someone we've already met so far, Annette Tender, who is sidekick, spouse, and one of the organizers of this. Annette, can you please share your story with us?
Sure. Thank you. So Doug and I, we met in college, and we've been married for 30 years. And we moved to Frederick, Maryland in the mid-90s, and we have one son that Doug already mentioned. And so you've heard a little bit about why we started CAPES, and then Doug was able to explain more. So in that, you know, we have regular life that just keeps on happening. And so I work as well. My professional life, I'm director of marketing and business operations for a financial planning firm. We also really enjoy and are blessed at a lot of things we can do fun as a family. So we do a lot of traveling, skiing, and boating. And then also I like to give back to my community. So I do a lot of community volunteer work. The one drawback I think I have is I overcommit, because I have a hard time saying no to fun. So we try to keep brevity in our family, even though there could be this difficult situation at times. Why do I care about this topic is I love my husband, and we're best friends. He told me about his sexual abuse in college in our 20s. And we've been on this healing journey together, and you could see that through his timeline. We each were on it differently, but together as well too. The impact of abuse, that trauma, as he mentioned, stays into adulthood, and it has affected our relationship as a couple and with our son and his parenting. So that's one of the reasons why I care about this topic. The other one is, that's really more in the forefront for me, is I feel the abuser continues to have power long after the sexual abuse stops. And I just feel like that power needs to be crushed. And for many years, I was in a position where Doug didn't feel comfortable with me sharing what happened. So I had to keep a secret and remain silent along with Doug for 25 plus years, which just is what the abuser wanted. And so as a supporter, Two, we're also kind of the forgotten victims, so I like to talk about that. And so if I can share my story along with Doug, and if we can help another survivor and their family heal by taking away that power from the abuser, we're glad to be able to do that.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you for sharing that. I do want to say I've seen a couple things in the chat, just to clear out a couple. Because the chat feature is not open, a couple of people wanted to use the Q&A feature to let you know, Doug, how much they are proud of you and how much they love that you shared your story and what an effect it had. I think a lot of people mentioned that. I know that's not a question, but that is definitely a statement. To move on, I would like to give the floor right now to David Washington. He's a survivor. David, can you please share a little bit of your story and your why?
Thanks. It's an honor to be here, and thank you, Hartley House, for sponsoring this. I'm a survivor of childhood rape and sexual abuse starting at age 7 and lasting to age 16. I'm a person in long-term recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder and in 28 years of recovery from a substance use disorder. I currently work as both a therapist, as a trauma-informed service provider, and as a harm reductionist. And I'm the founder of the International Week of Awareness for Male Sexual Assault Survivors, which is the first full week in April. Why am I here? I'm here to share my story of recovery and the components that have empowered me and inspired me to live a life worth living. I'm a member of 1 in 6, the Bristlecone Project, which is a group of over 200 men from around the world who share their story of recovery in an open forum. And you can find the Bristlecone Project on our website. So why do I care? Doug talked a lot about it. The impact of male sexual abuse and rape is so impactful on a person's life, physically, spiritually, and mentally, that once I obtain my voice, I can't be silenced. That old adage, silence equals death. As I speak out, I am fulfilled and given, again, a life that's worth living. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David, for being here. Thank you for sharing your story. If you have questions for David, make sure to mark David in the chat. He's part of our panel, and keep in mind we're not using the chat feature. We're using the Q&A feature. Up next, I would like to open the floor to our therapist for the evening. And I think it's important, Inga mentioned this earlier, this is not a therapy session. This is not a licensed therapy session. We have a therapist here as part of the discussion. I would like to open the floor to Paul Hatfield. Paul.
Thanks, Pat. Before I talk about myself, I have to express my pride and respect for Doug too. Without Doug, we wouldn't be here, and he's just amazing. So I had to say that. About myself, I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. I've been a resident Frederick County for almost 30 years, and my wife and I raised our 3 children here. I currently live and have a counseling practice in downtown Frederick, and it's just a wonderful community to be a part of, and it's a wonderful mental health community to be a part of as well. There's just a great community of therapists and counselors here in Frederick. Currently in my practice, I see about 30 adult individuals per week. And I see them for a variety of issues, but with a primary focus on trauma. My interest in trauma spans my career. I started out doing non-directive play therapy with kids who suffered abuse, and my relationship with trauma has evolved over the years, so that currently I do EMDR and other modalities with adults, both individually and in groups. Why am I here? Well, in 2017, I was asked by Hartley House to lead the Male Survivors Group, which has been an amazing experience. We meet every other week. We've met every other week for over 2 years now, and it's become a really tight group. And I've just been astounded at the growth and the vulnerability and the trust that has developed between these men and their devotion to the group. It's been an inspiration to me, both personally and professionally. And why do I care? Well, I care about all my patients, and part of the reason I care so much about them is I connect with them. I find connection to be therapeutic. As Doug said earlier, I think that the healing is individual, and it's a connection, and it's also intimate. It's therapeutic to connect with people, and in a group setting, I feel like that connection grows exponentially because I'm able to connect with the members of the group, and they all connect with one another, and they heal and grow with one another, and it's just an incredible thing to witness. I think survivors suffer in silence, and they're not alone. And this work has taught me the power of bringing men together to build trust and growth and healing. So I am delighted to be a part of Hartley House's effort to reach out and let survivors know that they have support here in our community.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for all that you're doing. And our final panelist, thank you so much for being here tonight. Monica, you're a survivor parent. Can you please share your story and talk about your why?
Thank you so much, Patrick. I am the parent of a male survivor. When my son was 23 years old, he came to us and disclosed that he had been abused by a teacher in middle school. And it was very shocking for our family, especially since when the abuse had occurred, my son had come to live with us through adoption, and he had been living with us for about 2 years. And we were just completely devastated, mainly because we felt that we were giving him a chance to have a new lease on life, something new, a fresh start. And, right under our very watch, our watchful eye and our watchful heart, this happened to him. And just like the statistics you mentioned before, and it just hit me now when you were saying that, I mean, it happened when he was 12, but he didn't disclose till he was 23. And the reason why he disclosed was because the person who abused him was a teacher and met a very tragic fate, a very publicly tragic fate. And when it hit the news, what happened to that teacher, my son disclosed what had happened to him. And so, pretty much everything we had known in those years, from the time he was 12 to the time he was 23, just no longer made sense. Like everything just was a complete wash, and we really had to rebuild and start over again. So I believe my role is to just walk with my son in his journey as he continues. He is 33 now, so that was 10 years ago that this happened to our family. And I consider myself an ally to parents who are just learning this news from their own children, maybe adult children or teens or any age, I guess, but it just is so shocking and devastating. There are a lot of really hard feelings that come with it. So I do consider myself an ally to parents that are working through these things with their male children. And I worked as a teacher actually for 15 years, and it really changed my life. What happened to my son? Like I said, everything I thought was true turned out not to be, and it caused me to really re-examine what I was doing with my life and where I wanted to go. So I work now as a family support worker in a different capacity, not specifically with families experiencing the same kind of trauma, but still a work of the heart. And it allows me to continue to process what my family's going through, but also serve others around me. And I'm here because I, as a parent, there are a lot of different feelings, the loneliness, the guilt, understanding what grooming looks like. I think, maybe that'll open up a little bit, hopefully. Not that we should be ashamed of not realizing it, but the more we talk about it and bring it, to the table, maybe other parents can also listen and watch, and maybe some of it will resonate. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Actually, I just like, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I see those, but before we move on, considering that the third largest chunk of our audience from the poll was people who were unfamiliar with any survivors or this in general, you just used the term grooming. Could you please just give a basic explanation of what that is, and then maybe some of the warning signs that you'd like to tell parents about?
Sure. Actually, I don't know, Paul, did you want to maybe give a more clinical approach to, kind of what grooming looks like, and then I can kind of talk about maybe some examples of what happened with my son? Does that sound okay?
Sure. If it seems like a disservice to boil grooming down to a single sentence because it's such a complex web. But if I were to use a single sentence, it would sound like this: grooming is a deliberate and carefully orchestrated process of targeting, isolating, and gaining the trust of a child in order to initiate and maintain a secret sexually abusive relationship. And when I say it that way, it sounds tactical, but I have to say that the experiences that I've learned from survivors about grooming, it is tactical, but it's also kind of like a magic trick, because it involves misdirection, sleight of hand, and also, later when you learn how the trick was done, you can't believe that you got fooled by it, and you kind of blame yourself for it. So it's a very complicated process, and I'd be happy to talk about parts of it, but I don't want to hog the screen time. So I'll refer back to you, Monica, if you want to talk about your experience.
Sure. And I think exactly what you said, targeting, but not in an aggressive way. So my son's abuser was a teacher and a coach in his middle school. And so he sort of began paying extra attention to my son. And he used the platform of the sport. So, complimenting my son on his athletic abilities and really making him out to be this, amazing person on the team. And now that I look back, I think about okay, teamwork, team player, how did my son function within the team? But that wasn't the agenda of that coach. When I think back to the language he would use when he would describe my son's athletic abilities, it was just special attention to my son, and so building trust as well, little opportunities to build trust with my family. And like you said, it's so shocking because you're like, how did I get tricked? Like, how did that even happen right in front of me? At the time, we were thinking like, wow, this coach is, he really values my son. This is going to be it for this kid. He's going to finally make it. It's going to be so great for his self-esteem, but it was a trick. And there was a lot of time spent on that. So, and they were just small little things, special, hey, we're going to have special practice, just a few of the kids. And then, my son would say, yeah, he just kept wanting me to do it. And again, at the time, didn't realize that was all part of grooming. There was a part that happened that we didn't know, like I said, until my son disclosed the whole thing, where the coach accused my son of taking money from his office. So the locker room had an office off to the side, and he accused my son of taking money. It was $40. It wasn't a lot of money, but we ended up paying the money back to the coach because my son was really distraught about it. And the coach was saying how my son was going to lose, the opportunity to play. And he understood that, maybe my son couldn't control his impulses. And then my son disclosed those years later that when he wanted to break away from this relationship that the coach had tricked him into, that was a tactic that the coach used And I don't know if it was like a punishment or like a manipulation or like kind of like, see, I'm going to get you in trouble. So now you need to really do what I say because next time it'll be worse. And that was really, really horrible as well. So just those are some kind of what come to mind when I think of grooming.
Oh, thank you so much for answering that question. We have a lot of questions from Monica in the Q&A right now. I just want to address, I'm going to group a couple into one question. I want to move on to a couple of the other panelists. We have a lot of parents in the Q&A, and just to kind of theme a couple of our questions together, what were the first steps to help once it was brought up? How did you start trying to help your child? What was the first step there? What were some of the early steps?
So we saw the incident come out on the news that sparked the conversation in my home where my son told us what happened to him. So we were watching the news, and my husband and I, and my son appeared in the room. And his face, just like it looked like all the blood drained from his face. And he sat down, and then he began to tell what had happened to him. And I don't know that we slept that night. I think we just did a lot of listening and talking and crying. And so the first steps were just being right there with him. We didn't, as a parent, you want to call the police and you want to say like, okay, we have like another person here that's saying this happened and how many years ago. And at the time I didn't realize that, the length of time for reporting and things like that. And so we actually did it the next morning, but we spent a lot of time listening that night. The next day, just asking my son, like, what do we do? And the police referred us to a crisis center off Girard Street in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And that's where we went with my son. He was old enough to go by himself, but we went with him, and he was connected to professional support the next day. And they walked him through that journey.
Thank you so much for sharing that. To move on to a different topic, David, a lot of people were reaching out in the Q&A just to say they thank you for sharing your story and your experience. And to combine a couple of questions about what happened, how do you think stigmas have changed over the years? And how did you initially share your story? And what impact did you see in that in your life?
The first time I shared my story, I was had been on the board of Witness Justice in Frederick, and one of the Helga Luce asked me if I'd be willing to testify on Capitol Hill. And at that point, I'd been a therapist or counselor since 1989, and I wasn't for sure that I wanted to go public and disclose what had happened, since I had never shared it with my family other than the rape. And as I thought about what I do for a living, which is ask men and women to share their story with me, it became really clear to me that I had an opportunity where I could share my story and have an impact on a pretty large scale. So the first time I shared my story in a public forum was on Capitol Hill.
And how do you believe, with being in the field, how do you feel like stigmas have changed over the year? And this is something that anyone of the panelists can talk about. In particular, just I feel like there was an inflection point with like Sandusky, as Doug brought up. Has stigma changed? Are you seeing more of a willingness for people to open up, or is it just the same as it always was?
And for me, I think that the stigma has changed, partly because we've become much more verbal. Groups such as 1 in 6 that are doing campaigns around the world and sharing that message that it wasn't what's wrong with us, it's what's happened to us. And as a result of that, we no longer have to be silent. And people like Doug and myself that can go on a campaign, go to the newspaper, be on television and say, look, this happened to me. I'm healing. I'm better. I'm here. And if you have the opportunity to share that there are men like us that are going to be there to hear you.
We also had a follow-up question to that wanted to know if race had any role in your community. Particularly the questioner said, being a Black woman, our community does not discuss it at all. do you have any extra issue or turbulence from that?
Well, for any man, there's the whole
Yeah.
issue of vulnerability. And I think for African American men, it can be even more so, even in today's society, where we're constantly hypervigilant, which is one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. It can be much more difficult for an African American man to verbalize that for fear that he'll be stigmatized as being gay, which we know is not a result of male sexual abuse. So yes.
Thank you for answering that question. Paul, we had a real early question in this about long-term effects. Are there any big studies going on to educate people about the psychological long-term effects that this has on when a male child or even a female child is abused?
I'm sorry, was that directed to me, Patrick?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Paul. One of the earliest questions we had in the chat, in fact, it's the first question we got. Someone want to know what efforts are being done for long-term studies into the psychological effects of sexual abuse.
I don't have the answer to that.
Oh, okay, that's okay. We can move on. Annette, I wanted to kind of ask you a question. How did you guys, if you can or want to answer this, and this is for you and Doug, how do you bring up this topic to your son or your child? You're still muted.
Yeah, that is a great question, Patrick, because we still have debates about that.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that we needed to tell our son from at a very early age. Doug was not in agreement with that. So we came up with a compromise. And you can tell the compromise. I got tears in my eyes, so it's emotional for me.
Mm. Doug,
So I mean, we did tell him, what had happened. It was a difficult conversation. So I mean, it's one thing to potentially tell a therapist or tell a friend, but then to bring it up with your son is an extremely difficult challenge. Just to your point of stigma, whether or not it's truly there or not, a survivor is still going to carry an enormous amount of shame attached to that. So it's a difficult thing to do. I'm blessed that he understood it and knows where we are. Supports both Annette and I on this journey, and I think that's a critical step in in the community reference I was trying to make is each of those you start to peel that back, and it's building that trust that it'll work.
Yeah, and so part of our compromise was I would just try to teach them things about not stranger danger, because that's not really where the abuse happens. Yes, some people are, but they're like we talked earlier. David had the incident where his was more violent, and then the grooming where they had the whole family to be trusted. So I would talk about that with him and just your bathing suit parts and stuff like that. And as he got older, we would have more and more conversations about relationships and things of that nature. Just recently, within the past 2 years, when Doug started to speak about this publicly, is when we disclosed to our son. So he's 23 now, so he was about 20. Mm-hmm. He didn't know. So, we had to have discussions a little bit as well, too, as to, do you understand why your dad did some things that he did as a parent, and how I reacted. And so it is difficult.
Paul, I have a question for you. When someone starts to seek treatment for this, how often is it that they come in for something different and then open up as this the cause? Are you seeing a lot of patients come to you through like anger management, or what's the root way that someone comes to therapy or reaches that step that it comes to?
Yeah, Patrick, I think it's very common for a patient to come in to therapy for another diagnosis, another primary reason, and not disclose that they are survivors, you know, till well into therapy. So yeah, I think that's a pretty common thing. And I think that this kind of outreach and just the, you know, people knowing about the group, et cetera, is with any luck is going to change that, you know, embolden people to come in and say that that's what they're there for. At the same time, I completely respect if people do not want to disclose that there's a survivor, even with their therapist for a while, because I think they need to be ready to do that. And I think that sometimes there are lots of complexities and secondary traumas that are worth working on, and you know, gaining stability, and many other areas that you can, as a therapist, be there for your client without diving right into, you know, sexual abuse. I feel like they're going to get to it when they're ready to get to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, is it similar to treating PTSD? Is it a form of PTSD? Would you?
It is similar. Now, PTSD, you know, is a diagnosis that has a specific criteria. It involves the exposure to, you know, a life-threatening event, and then there are criteria like intrusions, like bad dreams or memories or feelings, avoidant behavior, avoiding situations that will remind you of the event, a negative cognitive bias, thinking about things in a negative way and therefore having negative moods, and having just a heightened sense of arousal. Now, the difference between that and someone who's sexually abused as a child is that it's so intense that it becomes complex PTSD. So with those intense, you know, heightened states of arousal and negative bias and intrusions, you tend to have difficulty getting through stages of development. So you continue to be re-traumatized throughout your life, and then, you know, you act out, and that's trauma too. Sometimes behaviors become traumatic, and so it's a much more complex sort of web of. Let me put it this way: it becomes not so much something that happened to you, but who you are. You know, the trauma becomes who you are. It becomes interwoven into your identity. So it's a much trickier thing to work on.
And I think that kind of fits in with what you're talking about, how it can return and come back. David, you do a lot of work helping people with substance abuse. Do you see this as being two things that are connected?
Yeah, fairly frequently we see, especially in the treatment realm of substance use disorder, when we look at people that have multiple relapses, we kind of look for the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and sometimes one of those adverse experiences has been sexual abuse. And I love what Pat was saying, that it's not unusual that a person will not meet the diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder. And there can be any number of things. For me, there was eating, there was overeating, so there were eating issues, there were sleep issues. And initially we were not looking at post-traumatic stress, we were looking at substance use disorder. But it wasn't until I started to address the sexual abuse, well, actually addressing the substance use issue, that the sexual abuse was brought to my awareness by a therapist.
So it can be a real complex. Speaking of therapy as well, this is a question I'm seeing a lot in the Q&A that I want Monica and Annette to kind of address is not just but for the survivors, therapy is also for the family members. Monica, can we hear from you first, and then Annette, if you want to chime in on that. What help should a parent or a spouse see? Or what did you see?
So for me, in my situation, I was and still find myself sometimes incredibly angry. And so that is what I focused on with a therapist, just the anger, the things that this person took from my son. Even to this day, sometimes there are little things that happen and I look and I think like, wow, I see him behaving or acting that way because he's having a hard time trusting right now. And I can't help but think that if this didn't happen to him, how his life would be different. And then the piece also about my self-trusting. So here was this person who kind of, gained the trust of our whole family. And how could I ever look at a therapist and trust that person without thinking they have some kind of agenda, or are they enjoying my story too much right now? So, I went through many, many therapists. Somebody once told me that it's okay to continue to seek a therapist until you find the one that is the right fit. And they likened it to, like, they said, you didn't marry the first guy you dated, which I know it's kind of a weird thing to say, but, if it's not a right fit, it's not a right fit. And so it's taken me a lot of time, and I sometimes engage in therapy really well over a period of like 8 to 12 weeks. And then I feel like I'm doing better, and then I stop, and then things will trigger it again. And then I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I should probably go back and talk to somebody because I'm starting to feel really upset or angry at what he took from my son. So it was more about my own feelings, I guess, is what I'm saying, not necessarily about how to support my son, because I love my son. So I'm going to be right there with him and walk that path with him. If he's taking small steps, I'm going to take small steps. I'm not going to walk ahead or behind. I'm going to walk alongside. If he's taking big, giant, long steps, I'm going to take big, giant, long steps too. But at the same time, addressing my feelings about the situation so that he doesn't have to tolerate that. He doesn't have to shoulder that burden as well, because that's not fair to him. Now, my husband, on the other hand, really, really still struggles to this day. Really upsetting for him. Same thing, continuing to look for a therapist that he can connect with. And so I know, Annette, you're supporting your husband in one way, but then two parents in a household, we are also processing the whole thing as well. And so, figuring that piece out, being able to work together. Neither of us have a problem supporting our son. It's our own feelings about what happened that we have to make sure that we keep in check. So therapy is very, very, very important. And I think it's cognitive behavioral therapy, Paul. I'm not sure, but a therapist taught me to do this thing where, like, when a thought pops in my mind, he kind of said, it's like you see a dog and you're worried about the dog. Is it on the leash? Is it not on the leash? Is the owner there? Is it checking me out? And so you're kind of doing this assessing in your brain. And then instead of getting caught in that loop of assessing this dog coming to attack you, you begin to talk to it like, oh, look at that. I'm having that thought again. That's interesting. Oh, okay. All right. I'm still having it. Okay, let me take some deep breaths. Oh, okay, the thought's going away now. I'm okay now. And so a therapist taught me to do that. So whenever I see my son, something happens and it triggers me, I kind of think like, oh, look at that. Here I go. I'm starting to feel upset about it. I wonder how long this is going to take. Okay, all right, let me take some deep breaths. Okay, it's subsiding. And so I think of those triggers as like a dog on or off the leash, and I kind of talk myself through it. It's very helpful. So therapy was very helpful for me.
And
yeah. For just a follow-up question before you begin, a lot of people were curious, did you seek therapy before you, as you talked how you couldn't share the story. Some people were curious if it's too personal, you don't need to go into this, but did you seek therapy before you were able to open up to your family?
For me, yeah. So Doug and I, when he first told me, and you're keeping that secret with someone, you're in your 20s, you're in college, you're like, yeah, oh, not a big deal, right? You don't realize the magnitude of the impact, right? Fast forward, we get married, and then you start having just regular, what you assume, marital issues, and then you're like, well, maybe we should go talk to someone just to get things straightened out. And then you realize, well, wait a second, these are more for a lot of these things that everyone's been talking about, some of the inability to trust and different things that boundaries just aren't always there, or they don't understand their gut instinct a lot of times. So, so yeah, we would have therapy as a couple and then individually. So we did that for a little bit, but it just wasn't there early on in our marriage, in the time frame, because therapy wasn't that far along yet. They didn't, and there was a lot of people who really didn't understand what the impact was, especially to men. So, so we muddled along. We try all these different things and just muddled along. So then, a few years ago is when we were able to really get some quality therapy. So yes, I was had some therapy before. Doug did let me disclose little by little to different people as he gained trust with them as well too. So like I was able to tell my parents pretty early on in our marriage. I had a couple of close friends I could talk to because I'm not a big secret keeper, so I needed an outlet to be able to have and be able to talk to people about some of these things and what was impacting. And but yeah, so even now I still go to therapy. I haven't gone in a while because I really haven't felt the need to. I haven't had a lot of triggers. I felt like Doug and I were in a good place now. His healing journey has come really far, but for a while there was some really dark days, and kind of like what Monica said, I was angry because financially we got to pay for this, for something that someone else did. That still makes me angry. You can tell my voice I'm angry about it. It still gets me angry. And so I just, so I've learned over the years when to seek advice professionally, who I can trust. And I did learn one good technique from one of my therapists as well too recently was because I will take things on, other people's feelings and stuff on, and she's like, well, that's not yours to have. Why is that? Why are you taking on his feelings? So she's like, put that in a suitcase and give it back to him. So even if he's not around, I will every once in a while, I'll say, this is yours. And so little techniques like that help. And but you do, it's a trial and error to find a therapist that you're going to connect with. I do feel like it's important to have your own therapist for your own advocacy. If you're in for us being in a relationship, I think it's important to have a therapist together as well. And then having our son, at times we would run into just issues for whatever reason. I felt was important. We would go to a therapist as a family as well too. So, so yeah, I think I answered all the questions that you had.
I have to thank everyone who's participating. We've been getting just a load of questions. I'm trying to bundle them together so we can make this.
Yeah.
For Paul, we are getting some people. It's a couple of times. People are asking if there's a difference between male survivors, in particular, in terms of treatment and diagnosis. Is there a difference between male survivors?
There is a difference. First of all, it hasn't been talked about. Male survivors are at the disadvantage of, if they're not disclosing for 20 years, as came up in our fact at the beginning of the program, they're spending a lot of time feeling like they're the only one. It hasn't been part of our cultural discussion. And so, I think that a lot of male survivors end up feeling like aliens, really. They feel like, that this has never happened to anybody else. The other thing is that men are very tied to, the idea of masculinity and what it takes to be a man. And unfortunately, the traditional norms of masculinity stand in the way of getting treatment and sharing. I mean, things like power and control and fearlessness and competition and stoicism, all of those norms of masculinity kind of get in the way of expressing yourself, seeking help. And as a result, there's a turning inward, and there's a lot of shame that I think men carry with them. In fact, I think that for men, a lot of times, you know, the process, even though it's an external process of being assaulted or sexually assaulted, they tend to dissociate from that and turn it inwards, and shame is an internally manufactured state where they take responsibility for what happens, and it's a very difficult thing to express and to process shame. One of the reactions, and I won't drag this out too long, but when you're holding shame is, rather than to be angry at the perpetrator, is to be angry at someone who taps into your shame. And if you could just imagine, if your shame, if a lot of it is centered on your manhood and your sexuality, then it's difficult to have those kinds of relationships without lashing out. So that's just one of many, I think, characteristics of treatment for a male survivor that are unique.
And you know what? I can't find a good way to bring this up. It's in my notes, and I really do want to know about it. EMDR. What is that about? That's in our notes, and I don't have an explanation for it.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because I could talk ad nauseum about EMDR. It's just a fantastic tool. It stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is kind of a misnomer because part of the protocol for EMDR is bilateral stimulation. So it was originally done by following someone's fingers, and as your eyes go from left to right, when you're looking left, it stimulates the right hemisphere of your brain and vice versa. So brings your full brain experience to the process. Now, and talking about brains is a real big part of EMDR, because when you experience trauma, there's a part of your brain called the amygdala, and it's your fight-flight response. It's down, it's down at the primitive part of the brain, and when trauma occurs, the reaction is, we've all experienced it, probably fight, flight, and what happens is, adrenaline, cortisol pumps through your body. But the other thing it limits parts of your brain, like blood flow to your cerebral cortex, so your executive functioning goes. Blood flow to a part of your brain called the Broca, which involves speech. There's a part, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which puts a timestamp. And all these things are offline when you undergo trauma. So as a result, what happens does not get processed. It gets fragmented. There are things that are out of time, and they kind of float around in your brain, and they get triggered, and it's as though the event is happening to you all over again, even though it may have happened 20, 30 years ago. So what EMDR does is it taps into those neural networks using this bilateral stimulation and bringing up an image, combining it with a cognition and emotion and the body sensation, taps in, and it helps to bring those fragmented experiences together to adapt them so that they're no longer problematic for you. When trauma happens, what happens is we develop a lot of erroneous beliefs, erroneous thoughts about ourselves and the world, erroneous emotions, feelings that don't fit the situation, and erroneous body sensations, feelings in your body that don't fit your situation. And EMDR helps to adapt those and process them to just make you be able to live in the world in a more rational way.
Well, thank you so much. I wanted to know that term. Well, we've reached near the end of our discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists for being a part of it, for giving us your time, for everybody that was here. Thank you all for being here, for sharing part of your story. And the good news is the work keeps on. All of you are to continue working out. If anybody has any extra questions, we actually covered the bulk of what was in the Q&A. CAPES isn't going away after this event. It's not going anywhere. So right now, if you leave, you'll be receiving a survey, but I'd like to give the final closing remarks back to Inga.
Hello, I'm really glad that you were here. We got some great questions, some good discussion going. I think this is how we need to approach this subject from now on in. Lift that stigma a little bit by opening up the conversation. Thanks again for coming. And please know that any resources you might need, some reading materials, some online kind of resources, they are on our website, hartleyhouse.org, on our resource page. Please feel free to check the page out, and there's a lot of good information there. Thanks again for coming. I hope that you learned something tonight. Good night.